A little while ago, I watched a science fiction film called I Am Mother. It's set after a catastrophic event has wiped out every human being on Earth. Before the disaster, 63,000 human embryos had been stored deep underground in a secure bunker. A robot selects one of those embryos and raises the child on its own. The story goes in a completely different direction after that, but the opening alone left me wondering about something fascinating. What sort of person would a child become if they were born into a world completely cut off from the outside? If it were somehow possible to raise a group of babies without them ever meeting another adult, how would they communicate with one another? What language would they end up speaking? The goal was to discover where language really comes from, and, on an even deeper level, to understand the foundations of human nature itself. Needless to say, deliberately isolating babies in this way is profoundly unethical. That's why cultural historians such as Roger Shattuck have preferred another name for these studies: the forbidden experiment. The earliest written account comes from the Greek historian Herodotus. Around 600 BC, the Egyptian pharaoh Psamtik I is said to have ordered that 2 newborn babies be taken from their parents and placed in the care of a shepherd. The shepherd was strictly forbidden from speaking to them. According to the story, the children eventually developed a way of communicating with each other. The very first word they supposedly uttered was bigos. The word didn't exist in Egyptian. Instead, it was believed to mean bread in the language of the Phrygians, an ancient people who had lived in what is now Turkey many centuries earlier. From this, the Egyptians concluded that the Phrygians must have been the oldest civilization, and that their own people, and even their language, had originated from Phrygia. Roughly 1800 years later, in the 13th century, another experiment was reportedly carried out under the orders of Emperor Frederick II. Once again, infants were separated from their families and raised with as little human interaction as possible. Their basic needs were met, but nobody was allowed to speak to them. Do you know why? People wanted to know what language these children would naturally speak if such a thing as an innate mother tongue really existed. The predictions were fascinating. Some believed the children would speak Hebrew. Others expected Greek, Latin, or even Arabic. These were the languages associated with sacred scriptures and the great civilizations of the ancient world. So, as you can probably guess, Frederick II's real ambition was to discover which language Adam and Eve had spoken in the Garden of Eden. The medieval chronicler Salim Ben, who recorded these events, never tells us what language the children actually spoke. Instead, he describes in disturbing detail the cruelty inflicted on them by the people carrying out the experiment. In later centuries, although no comparable experiments were officially conducted, there were children who grew up in extreme isolation through circumstances beyond anyone's control. These so-called feral children, raised without meaningful human contact, never developed language in the way most of us do. Take Oksana from Ukraine, for example. Because she spent her childhood living among dogs, she learned to communicate using behaviors and sounds that closely resembled theirs. She isn't the only case. Over the years, children have been discovered after being raised by dogs, bears, sheep, cattle, goats, and even ostriches. Unsurprisingly, they gradually adopted the behavior of the animals around them. Although many later learned everyday skills after returning to human society, most never fully acquired language. There's another way someone can become isolated from language from birth: deafness. When deaf children grow up surrounded by people who don't know sign language, researchers have observed that they often begin creating their own systems of communication. One remarkable example comes from Nicaragua. Until 1980, many deaf children there had never been able to communicate properly with anyone. In a sense, they had each grown up isolated from language. After the Nicaraguan Revolution, they were brought together at the country's first school for deaf children. The intention was to teach them sign language so they could finally communicate more easily. In a way, it was as though 100 isolated babies had suddenly been brought together under one roof, but by then they were no longer babies, they were children. And because of that, the teachers were unable to teach them the sign language they had planned. So what happened instead? The children began inventing their own sign language. Using hand movements, facial expressions, and gestures, they gradually created an entirely new way of communicating with one another. This time, it wasn't the children trying to understand adults. It was the adults trying to understand the children. Linguists were brought in to study this newly emerging language, and what they found was remarkable. According to the researchers, the children's language wasn't a collection of random gestures. It had genuine structure, surprising complexity, and a rich grammar of its own. It turns out that spoken sound isn't what makes language possible. Communication is part of what it means to be human. It's something deeply rooted in our nature. Even today, we still don't fully understand how language first emerged or how it evolved into the thousands of languages spoken around the world. But one thing is clear: language exists because it allows us to share knowledge. And that drive doesn't simply appear because lots of people happen to live together. Many linguists believe the real catalyst is a community of people who genuinely need to exchange information with one another. In other words, we grow through knowledge, and once we've learned something, we naturally want to pass it on. Perhaps that's why humanity has gone on to create more than 6,000 different languages. At the beginning beginning of this video, I mentioned the film I Am Mother, the story of a child raised by a robot. In the film, the robot communicates with the child much like a parent would. It speaks, teaches, and answers questions. Because the child grows up surrounded by language, there's never any need to invent a new one. Instead, the child learns about the world through conversation with the robot. During one of those conversations, the film introduces a modern version of the famous trolley problem, a philosophical thought experiment I explored in much greater detail in another video. While discussing the familiar question, whether it's better to save one life or 5, the conversation leads somewhere unexpectedly profound. For centuries, people have wondered what would happen if babies grew up completely isolated from the outside world. In the pursuit of an answer, countless unethical experiments were carried out. The real goal wasn't simply to discover the origin of language. It was to understand something even more fundamental. What does it actually mean to be human? Perhaps the answer isn't found by isolating other people, but by occasionally stepping away from the noise ourselves. Maybe that's when we begin to think more deeply. Maybe we start having conversations with the books we read, questioning our own assumptions, and refining the language inside our minds. I am mother. Perhaps in a sense, we all spend our lives searching for our own mother tongue. Not the language the Egyptian pharaoh imagined belonged to the ancient Phrygians, but the language the philosopher Immanuel Kant was pointing towards when he wrote that all language is the expression of thought, because thinking, at its heart, is simply a conversation we have with ourselves, and perhaps that is the highest form of language any human being can ever develop.